Hi, welcome back to Power of Storytime. I'm Kate, the creative director of Calling Card Books and Z Girls Press. And every Wednesday at noon Pacific Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we read from one of our books. We've been working our way through Finding the Lost, which is the second book in the Moose Beach trilogy. And today we are joined again by the author, Michael Foster. So thanks for being with us again, Michael.
Hi, Kate. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. It's great, and one of the things we wanted to talk about today was you just got a wonderful review. In the first book, some of the proceeds from it are going to an organization called the Wildland Firefighters Foundation, and one of the ladies who works for it, Dina, she wrote and said, "Hi Michael, I wanted to touch base and let you know that my 13-year-old daughter loved the book. She loved it so much that we ordered the second one this week. Thanks so much for all you do." So that was a really sweet review of the first Moose Beach book.
It was, waking up to open my inbox and find that kind of email. Honestly, it made my entire week. I was happy all day, and to know that what I'm writing is actually touching or exciting, and for young children, and making hopefully inspiring them to be adventurous. I love it. It's the best feeling.
Yeah, we were just talking about this off camera before we started, but Marta was saying, like, you never know who these books are going to touch and how it's going to impact different people's lives. So it's really cool when people do share how much they've enjoyed it or what it's meant to them.
It's an honor to do what we do.
Yeah. And we're especially touched and especially excited to be able to work with the Wildland Firefighter Foundation, because for Marta and I personally, like, our home burned down in one of the 2007 wildfires. We've got some of the photos of it up on the screen. So we, I don't know if you probably can't see, Michael, but in the background we have like the firefighter truck and some of the firefighters that were from another part of the state. We were in San Diego at the time, and I think they were probably from NorCal or a different state, but they came by every week to make sure all
every
the hot
day,
spots,
every day for about a week until they called to another active fire. They were looking for hot spots, and we had horses on the property and a manure composter, and so they kept knocking out the manure composter.
Yeah, so we know how hard they work and really appreciate everything they do, because it's an extremely dangerous job, but especially here in California, it's so important because we keep getting these crazy wildfires and getting more and more of them. But we know this has kind of touched you as well, because the fire, there's been some fires in Idaho as well, and they've kind of come close to your cabin. So what was that experience like for you?
Can I bust in for one? Let me bust in for 1 second. And this is our hillside. This was not our hillside. It was approaching our property. And when I started seeing signs of life among the burn, it made me so happy. We burned at the end of October 2007. February 2008, all of that ash just fed the hillsides, and the color was stunning. It's part of nature. It's part of nature's circle of life, and so it has to happen. And so, back to you, Michael. Excuse my interruption.
So 2007. That was the same year for us, and it was in July, I believe, and into August, that it was called the Cascade Complex fire came through, and it was just massive. And the scars remain to this day of the damage that it did. I was at the cabin when the lightning storm came through that started the fire, and I had to leave shortly after, and I wasn't aware. My mother was still there, and she was giving me updates as to what was happening with the fire, and I could also track it online on satellites, and I could see that the entire Boise National Forest looked like it was red. Except for this small green spot that was around our lake. and I would hear that the firefighters were just working so hard to protect the cabins and do what they could. It was a terrifying time, and a lot of us were convinced that we were going to lose the cabin. But in the end, they saved it, and it was as I was writing the first book. I began the writing process at the cabin. I was there when I started it, and the idea came from there. And I realized that I never would have been inspired to write this book, and maybe never even move forward with it all. It would just been something that had never been created if not for these firefighters and what they do. And because of that, I really wanted to give back and support it. And the Wildland Firefighter Foundation is something that supports the families of firefighters that were killed in action or firefighters that were injured, and they assist the injured firefighters and their families. And I think it's just a wonderful cause. These guys are heroes. Not only the wildland firefighters, but all firefighters that are going into extremely dangerous situations to protect humans, to protect animals, to protect buildings. It's amazing, and I just want to give back.
Yeah, it really is such a the work they do is incredible, and it's so dangerous a lot of times, especially because it seems like over the past couple of years the fires have gotten more intense and more frequent, because I think it was 2004 there were also big fires in San Diego, and it was a similar experience to you, where we could see fires all around our house, we could see the hillsides glowing, but it never came to us, so we felt a little bit safer the second time around when we actually did burn. But it's just incredible the power of these fires, and to face those and try and protect people and protect people's homes is a pretty selfless act.
When you think about the fact that fires happen during the hottest time of the year, they wear hundreds of pounds of equipment under waterproof rubber suits, and they go the wildland guys go into unknown territory. The city guys deal with chemical fumes, and I mean, they are truly heroes.
Yeah, my father, for a while when he was young, worked the fire lines, and was exposed to a lot of different chemicals, and back then that was I believe in the 50s, maybe early 60s. The chemicals were even harsher and more dangerous, and when he ultimately passed away from cancer, the doctors had determined that it was probably brought on due to the exposure of the chemicals fighting those fires. So, it touches me in another way as well, wanting to support these families.
It's very, very personal.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you to your dad for doing that, because that's pretty incredible. And I guess to bring it to a lighter fire note, before either Marta or I had ever even published a book or been involved with publishing at all, our Dalmatian girl was beat us to the punch and was published in a dog training trick book. So she's on the back here doing a little handshake in front of the fire engine. There was a fire day at our local firehouse, and she blended right in.
She was a therapy dog, and Liz Palika, the woman who started the Love on a Leash program, is a prolific, award-winning author and animal writer. And long before, as Kate said, long before any Zarella had any idea that we would be involved in books, Girl the Dalmatian got published.
She beat us to the punch.
Nice.
So,
Okay, well, I think that's everything I have. Did you have anything else to add, Floor Director? I know you remember a bit more about the fires and everything than I do.
I just, we have the pandemic right now. We are in fire and hurricane season, and I just say, to all first responders, firefighters, paramedics, police officers, all shapes, sizes, colors, genders, we appreciate you and we thank you. And we appreciate your support of that organization, Michael.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Okay.
All right. Now, it sounds like you've got another busy day. Or would you be able to join us to read, or do you need to get back to work?
No, I do have a busy day. It's never ending right now.
All right. Well, with this wonderful horn noise we've got in the background, we'll say thanks again for joining us, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I will at least be listening in the background as I continue my work.
All right. Well, we'll get back to Alicia and her adventure. Last week, she made it to Thunderbolt and found out about the backstory behind Gran'Tree. But Thunderbolt wasn't able to help her with her parents, so he has now directed her to find Vulcan and look for help from Vulcan. So, let me bring this picture up.
Say bye-bye.
Bye, Michael.
All right. So we will continue with Chapter 10, Going Home. All right. Alicia banged on the door of the small cabin and hollered for Thunderbolt to answer, but only silence greeted her. She tried to turn the handle, but it was locked from the inside. Unbelievable, she spat, frustrated and tired. She gave up and turned away. She stepped to the edge of the mountaintop and looked to the southwest, far beyond where her cabin would have been, just past the large clearing known in her world as Stoll Meadows. Not the same meadow that Gran'Tree once presided over, but it was still a sizable place. She knew hot springs dotted the hills. Beyond there, she would find the next ancient, Vulcan. It was only lunchtime, and she still had most of the day ahead of her. Alicia walked to the door and banged on it one last time before turning towards the trail, starting to make her way back down the mountain. The girl felt disappointed beyond belief because she had hoped that Thunderbolt would have a solution. Instead, she left his domain filled with new questions that had no answers. What did he mean, "I gave you my power"? She thought. He had said he could see it in me. Others had said so too. But if it's true, why can't I use it? Frustration upon frustration built up inside of her. Alicia had discovered a solution to save her parents. There was magic in her that she could not use, and all she had found was a tired old man who refused to help her. And now she traveled over twice as far as she had to the top of Thunderbolt's mountain, all for the hope, the tiny chance, that the ancient called Vulcan would have answers she needed. "Arg!" she screamed above the treetops, balling her fists, letting pent-up frustration out into the world. She stamped her feet on the ground and raised her face to the sky. "Arg!" She screamed until she was out of breath, then stood there, letting the frustrated, negative energy drain from her limbs. Her mind went over everything she knew, trying to assemble the facts as she saw them, thinking analytically about the situation, like she did when she was preparing for a test at school. Okay, so I was called to the wild side, and Thunderbolt gave me his magic to defeat Gran'Tree. Was that the protection he said he gave me? Why couldn't he defeat the tree himself? And why did he say I was born to do this? Again, more questions with no answers. But she had learned something. She learned the origin of the terrible yellow pine. She learned that even beings with tremendous strength are fallible. One should never play lightly at being God. One should never play God at all. "All right, fine," she said, spinning around and yelling up towards the mountain's peak. "I'll go talk to Vulcan. Do I have any other choice?" She didn't think Thunderbolt would hear her, and even if he did, he made it clear he was finished talking. Alicia resolved to continue to the next ancient and made her way down the mountain, collecting berries and chewing on handfuls of trail mix along the way. At least the rain had stopped. She reached the narrow canyon with the fallen tree. Crossing back was scary, but this time she crawled the whole way across. Alicia considered the time difference again. 4,000 years. Was it really possible? Of course, she knew it was. It all made sense. 15 minutes in her world's time equated to 2 weeks here. Then 3 years must equal... The truth is, she didn't want to do the math. She'd already done enough homework this summer, but she certainly believed it could be over 4,000 years. Back home and in school, she had rarely thought about her friends from the wild side. But now, as she walked down the mountain trail, she took a moment to mourn them. They had been an interesting bunch, and they supported her in this strange place during their last visit. Were they drawn to her by magic? Was that at the core that brought them all together? She knew that feeling of being a strange little family held them together throughout their short journey. But had magic been that initial connection? Unknown but felt in a way they couldn't explain? Maybe. And maybe that same magic drew the great cat to her. Thinking about the cougar, Alicia quickly searched the woods, but saw no sign of the beast. The cat did not mean much, though. She hadn't seen the cat at all the previous day. It moved like some kind of ninja cat, always blending into the surroundings. Tawny, Alicia's name for the golden-eyed cat, had certainly shown up in the night when the night fell, looking for food, and she fully expected to see her again tonight. Those huge yellow eyes were magnificent and hypnotizing. Yes, Tawny, she thought. That's a good name, fitting for a cougar. Alicia continued to pick her way down the mountainside, following the trail for the most part. At one point, veering off towards the river she'd heard in the distance, hoping to find a waterway wide and rapid enough to spot some fish. The young adventurer was in luck. The river here was not as rough as it had been earlier, with deeper pools downstream behind a few large boulders. Eddies formed there, small pockets where water would get caught and spin endlessly like a miniature whirlpool. These were perfect spots to find fish, and she ended up spearing 2, one for her and one for Tawny, just in case. She wrapped the fish tightly in the huge leaves nearby skunk cabbage and placed them into her pack, positioning them so that they would stay wrapped, keeping the raw fish from touching her other things. Alicia reached the bottom of the mountain before dark and had plenty of time to set up camp for the night. She was becoming quite the pro at this and had the fire going in record time. As she worked, she saw the floating lights were back. By this time, it would have felt strange for them not to show up. Her curiosity about them grew. Are they trying to lure me away, to get me to follow them? The idea frightened her. Clearly, she still had undiscovered magic to learn about in this realm. Her fish was cooked perfectly, and while she worked on the second, as expected, Tawny walked slowly into her firelight. Alicia felt a shiver travel up her spine, but no longer felt the terror of before. Once again, she extended the stick with the semi-cooked fish on it towards the cat. Tawny didn't lunge this time, but instead stretched her neck forward and grasped the fish in her jaws. Pulling away, she sat back on her haunches and slowly chewed the fish, swallowing until it was gone. Alicia didn't know if the cat preferred the fish cooked, but she sure didn't seem to mind it that way. After finishing her meal, Tawny watched the girl a few seconds longer. Did she want something else, Alicia wondered? The answer was no. After staring another minute more, the great cat once again turned and faded into the night. Alicia wondered where she went. Was she off hunting for more food? Was she staying nearby but out of sight? Alicia didn't know, but she no longer worried about it. The cat was just another companion of sorts, one that didn't stay around, nor did it talk to her. It remained present nevertheless. In a small way, Alicia took comfort in that knowledge. The following day was mostly uneventful. She passed the time counting deer off in the distance and found frogs in a small pond. Watching them hop away as she approached reminded her of being younger and all the exploring she used to do. Alicia had left some of that behind in the past year or so, as she delved further into reading, studies, and hanging out with friends. She absolutely loved losing herself in a good book, and fantasy was her favorite, especially A Wrinkle in Time. She had read through Lord of the Rings series and finished the Chronicles of Narnia recently, which in some ways reminded her of her time at the lake and the amazing adventures she always experienced. Lately, she'd been reading more science fiction stories, which she loved almost as much as fantasy. Even though she didn't explore as much as she used to, Alicia still thoroughly enjoyed being outdoors, and she had places around the lake that were considered extra magical. Within days, sometimes within hours of arriving for any visit to the cabin, Alicia would always make a point to visit those special places. She thought of them as her places, and sometimes she needed only to touch base and restore the harmonic rhythms within her soul. Alicia wondered how many of those places existed here, in this realm, and would love to go looking for them, but she didn't have the time. However, the thought sparked an idea. She decided to make a small detour, which required briefly leaving the path she was on, but it shouldn't impact her travel too much. After all, if time flowed differently here, then only moments would pass in her world. She was curious to see the location of her cabin in this realm, and compare the difference, if any existed. It was late in the afternoon where she reached the spot on the trail that felt as if it was close to the road turnoff leading to where her cabin should be, though things looked very out of place, like one of those spot the difference puzzles where you compare two similar but not quite identical pictures. Her mental picture of here was one thing, but the reality of this realm had striking variations. She saw a huge tree here, or one missing there, bushy plants that didn't belong. Hiking off trail again was a chore, but thoughts of what she might find kept the girl's motivation high. Beginning to sweat in the afternoon heat, she stuffed her light jacket into her backpack, and a small number of scratches collected on her bare arms, but didn't deter her. Alicia thrashed quickly through the bushes and stepped lively over fallen trees that occasionally barred her path. When the passage was clear, she enthusiastically picked up speed even more, planning to camp on the very spot where her bed rested in her world. Wouldn't that be unique? After another hour or so of hiking, she could make out a familiar shape in the lakeshore in the distance, and she increased her pace. Moving quickly now, she reached the point where her cabin would have been. Dropping her gear to the ground, Alicia closed her eyes and stood there, listening to the sounds of the forest and feeling the wind kiss away the sweat on her forehead, trying to sense her world and the energies there. She held her breath, waiting. After a few moments, she slowly exhaled and opened her eyes. Nothing. She felt no connection to this once familiar spot. Alicia looked around. This area had little resemblance to her world. The trees were in different places, and the large boulder in front of her cabin was gone. Well, of course, she thought. Centuries have passed here, eons. Everything would be different. She walked where she estimated her bed stood, finding a large tree growing up right out of what would have been her pillow. Suddenly, she had an idea and scanned the environment again, comparing it to her mental map. Yes, right here. Stepping away from the tree, Alicia walked forward, slowly, carefully, searching the air in front of her, but there was still nothing. Wait. Oh my, she thought. Hanging in the air directly ahead was the thinnest sliver of light, its color shining through a slightly different tone than the rest of the world. She would never have seen it if she hadn't been looking for it so intently. Leaning forward, she pressed her eye close to the sliver of light and was able to look through. It was sort of like looking through a kaleidoscope, where the other side is all jumbled and distorted. But there, right where she last saw them in her world, were two figures she would recognize anywhere. "Mom and Dad," she whispered, almost reverently. A small cry escaped her. They stood frozen on the other side of the disturbed air, just like she had left them, trapped within their bubble of time. So it was true, she thought, tears rolling down her cheeks at the sight of them. The barrier had cracked, and now it's leaking into our world. She didn't know how much chaos this had caused. "Gran'Tree," she barked angrily, pulling away from the small crack. It wasn't enough that his prime had come close to destroying the wild side. Evidently, he had weakened the barrier so much that now, after his defeat, his actions threatened to destroy her world as well. My actions, she suddenly thought. After all, she was the one who had defeated Gran'Tree. If she had never crossed over the barrier, if she had never faced the great tree, would all of this have still happened? Great guilt had descended on her. Yes, in some ways, she was as much to blame as the Grand Tree was. But she was called, summoned. What had Thunderbolt said? She had done what she was born to do. He had called her, and she came. Did that mean she had no free will? Was destiny planned out from birth? No, she refused to accept that. Her decisions were her own. The Ancient Ones liked to think they were in control. They liked to think they could play gods. But look where it had gotten them. Alicia seethed with anger. If there was anyone to blame here, it was them. Beings that thought of themselves as all-powerful and severed two worlds, but in the process unleashed a monster that might ultimately destroy both worlds. She felt furious at the thought of it. The sun sank, and already the forest grew darker than she realized. Alicia quickly set up camp near the pillow tree. She hadn't gotten a chance to fish that evening, caught up in the excitement of seeing the location of her cabin, so she settled for another meal of jerky and nuts. Tawny did not come around that evening. Alicia waited, pieces of dried meat sitting by her side for the beast, but the cat never showed. Perhaps she felt Alicia's anger, or sensed it. Maybe she'd had enough of traveling with a human and chose her own way. Alicia sort of missed the cat. After 3 nightly visits, she started to grow fond of the cougar, even if the sojourns were brief. She didn't see the small dancing lights this evening either. Strange, she thought. Could their absence be connected to Tawny's? She didn't see how, but she would have to think about it more, later, when her head was clearer. Settling down for the night, she pulled the blanket over herself, while the heat from the fire warmed the one side of her body. Alicia's thoughts grew heavy. She expected to arrive at her destination tomorrow, but her mind went to the upcoming meeting with Vulcan, where she would demand answers. Her last thought before falling asleep was hope that the Ancient would be more forthcoming than Thunderbolt had been. Alicia's eyes flicked open, her senses suddenly alert. She heard something. Something familiar and frightening that awaked the oldest, most primal part of her brain, the one that controlled the fight or flight instinct. She had been lost in a troubled dream, the details of which flitted away like butterflies. Bits of color scattered on the breeze. But a sound had awoken her, bringing her neatly and cleanly out of the dream into full wakefulness. Alicia lay there, listening intently, her eyes nervously scanning the forest. The hastily assembled fire had died down to nothing but glowing embers, providing very little light, but the moon, almost full now, shone through the tree branches above, creating bright spots among the pockets of darkness. Within one of these pockets, she saw a vaguely recognizable outline of something. Something she was absolutely sure had not been there when she fell asleep. "Tawny?" Alicia called out to the shape in the shadows. "Is that you?" The thing in the shadows lifted its face to the moon and howled. So, now, we're going to continue on to Chapter 11, A Bond Formed. So I'm going to take a little sip of tea before we get into all the drama. Alicia leapt to her feet and grabbed one of the last remaining sticks from the fire. One end glowed with a red-hot ember. She held the stick in front of her, pointing it at the gray wolf that now emerged from the shadows, its head low and its teeth bared. The fur along its neck stuck up in a ridge that extended along the full length of its back. She blindly reached down to the ground with her left hand, searching, her eyes focused on the wolf in front of her. Closing her fingers around the object she found there, Alicia stood back up to full height, carrying the makeshift spear in her left hand. Standing in the darkness, weapon in each hand, she could have been mistaken for a primitive warrior she imagined herself as in the past. But she was no warrior, just a young girl scared out of her wits and ready to do anything necessary to survive. Another howl rose from her left. Of course, she thought, panicked. Wolves hunt in packs. She glanced to her left, seeing nothing but darkness, so she returned her focus to the immediate threat, the wolf facing her. slowly circling the remnants of the fire. Alicia thrust the stick with the glowing ember forward, swinging it rapidly back and forth, the red-hot tip leaving traces of light in the air. "Get out of here!" she shouted in desperation. "Go away!" The wolf backed off, and she managed a momentary feeling of relief. But the wolf only looked for another path to circle around the girl. Alicia cocked her arm back and threw the spear as hard as she could at the wolf. But she used her left hand, and the aim was off. Instead of the perfectly straight line she'd imagined, the spear flip-flopped through the air, its side striking the wolf's flank. Not strong enough to wound the beast, not hard enough to hurt it, causing the wolf to duck into the darkness of the woods to her right. She leapt forward quickly and scooped up the thrown spear, spinning back towards the fire just as the previously unseen wolf came charging from the darkness, growling ferociously. Alicia swung the spear in its direction, the worn point facing outward, which brought the wolf to a stop, his snarling muzzle revealing fangs, white and shining in the moonlight. She waved the ember at him, but this animal refused to back away. It lowered its upper body close to the ground, a deadly growl coming from deep within its throat. She could smell the stench of death on its breath. Alicia was terrified. She didn't know where the first wolf went. Perhaps it ran off for good when it was hit with a spear, but she doubted it. She wanted to search for it, but dared not take her eyes from the beast in front of her, which showed more courage than the one that fled. Alicia watched the wolf's muscles flex and tense. She sensed him preparing to jump, and started planning her next move when something large and golden raced past her on her left, knocking her onto her back and making her lose her grip on both weapons. Tawny! The cat leapt on top of the wolf, and in an instant, slashing with her sharp talons, ripping the long, bloody fissures into the side of the beast. Caught unawares by this attack, the wolf struggled to get back on its feet, clawing and snapping at the great cat, but unable to connect. Alicia watched from her position on the ground, lying on her back. She could see the wolf trying in vain to fight back against the larger, fiercer cougar. Suddenly, she heard a soft growl behind her. Craning her neck to look over her shoulder, she saw the first wolf, the one she hoped had fled, crawling forward very low to the ground, almost on its belly, sneaking in. The animal stretched forward, grabbing her ponytail in its teeth. Intense pain blossomed across her scalp, and her hands flew to her head as the wolf began to drag her away while the great cat was distracted. Defenseless, and holding her hair, trying to prevent it from being ripped out, she screamed, "No!" In a flash, Tawny loomed above her, paws on either side of Alicia's body. Alicia felt the immediate release of her hair and looked up to see nothing but the underside of the cat's chin, the white fur that trailed down to her belly. The cat screeched savagely at the retreating wolf, protecting the girl, shielding her with her enormous body. A drop of saliva, hot and wet, fell from the cougar's stretched lips, landing on the frightened girl's cheek. Despite Alicia's growing trust in the creature above her, this was all too much. She rolled onto her side and curled into a ball, closed her eyes and prayed silently. If there was ever a time she needed saving, now was that time. The wolf at Alicia's feet was gone, limping off somewhere to nurse its wounds, or perhaps even to die. The one that remained stared the cat face to face for a long moment before turning tail and fleeing as well. Tawny snarled loudly after the beast, before turning her face down and looking at the figure beneath her. In the silence that ensued, Alicia opened her eyes and looked up into the face of the cat. She saw the fury in those golden eyes, which frightened her. However, as she watched, the fury seemed to melt away, replaced by something else. The cat's features softened, while her big, furry chest heaved from the efforts of the fight. The cat looked at Alicia for a few seconds more, then stepped gently away, leaving the girl exposed and dazed by the experience. Alicia slowly sat up, examining the area around her, where streaks of blood, black as shadows on the moonlight, where the two creatures had fought. She looked at Tawny and saw blood there too, but she didn't know if it had come from the cougar or the wolf. The cat paced back and forth around the edge of the sleeping area Alicia had set up for herself. Clearly agitated, the cat made small huffing noises at whatever might be lurking out in the darkness, occasionally letting loose a louder growl, a clear warning to anything that might consider returning. Alicia crawled over to the stick with the burning ember and retrieved it. She searched the ground around it, making sure no stray sparks ignited anything, then returned the stick to the fire. Gathering some small twigs from nearby, she piled them around the ember, along with some witch's hair moss she had collected from the low-hanging branches of a tree. She blew gently on the ember, watching it grow brighter until a small flame took form and lit the rest of the material. Alicia added more small sticks to the flame, then sat down beside it, watching the orange colors dance, feeling her heart rate slow gradually. She didn't think she would get any more sleep tonight. Tawny continued to pace for a few minutes more, then lowered herself to the ground on the opposite side of the fire. Alicia understood that something had changed between them. The great cat would not leave her side tonight. Morning dawned and darkness left the forest, dragging with it the terror of the night before. Alicia stood slowly, stretching her leg muscles, which had cramped from being in a sitting position all night. In the light of day, the red blood on the ground stood out in stark contrast to the brown dirt and the dead pine needles. Tawny rose as well. There were no longer streaks of blood on her. Alicia imagined the cat must have spent the night cleaning herself, while she was lost in the depths of the flames, unaware of anything that night. The girl felt sore and tired this morning, a combination of tension and adrenaline from the attack. She wandered down to the lake shore, where the reeds along the shore had grown tall and wild. Pushing through, Alicia dipped her hands into the cold water. She scooped up some of the lake water, splashing it on her face and head, trying to shock some life back into herself. One splash was not enough, so she dipped into the water a few more times, then scooped handfuls of water and used them to wash her bare arms, cleaning off several days of sweat and dirt, wincing as she rinsed and cleaned the small scratches. When satisfied, she returned to her campsite, water dripping from her wet hair onto her shoulders. As she walked, feeling somewhat refreshed, her mind wandered. Did she save me because I gave her a few bits of fish and jerky? That can't be. Is she part of the magic that Thunderbolt gave me? Not her, but the connection between Tawny and me? That makes no sense. Neither does anything else. Alicia had disappeared from the campsite. Tawny had disappeared from the campsite. Alicia looked around and spotted the great cat a few yards away, moving through the brush, no longer hiding her presence from the girl. Alicia smiled at this realization, happy to know that they had formed an unusual bond. She didn't quite know what it meant yet, but she felt certain now that the cat would never harm her, and might even take care of her. Alicia gathered her things, put out the fire, took food from her pack, and saw her rations were about half gone. Alicia would need to take extra care of her supplies and spend more time eating berries and whatever else she could gather. That meant no snacks for the cat either. The cougar would have to hunt for her own food. If Alicia had luck fishing, then maybe she could share with Tawny, but she didn't know how long she would have to be in this realm, so it was better to be safe than sorry. Alicia packed her things, loaded up her backpack, and walked to the sliver of light hanging in the air. She bent to look through the crack one more time, seeing the distorted image of her parents on the other side. I don't know if you can hear me, she said, a lump of sadness in her throat. But I love you both, and I'm doing what I can to save you. To save our world. I hope you're okay and not suffering. She choked back a sob. I may have caused this, but I promise I'll fix it, somehow. She stood up looking at the crack for another moment before turning away. Alicia didn't know what was waiting for her at the hot springs, but regardless, that promise was something she intended to keep. All right. I think we'll leave off there for this week, and next week we will be meeting the next ancient Vulcan. So we hope you'll join us again next Wednesday at noon Pacific time, where we'll continue reading Finding the Lost. Hope you have a great day.